Tonight's lesson takes us right back to Matthew 22, where we were earlier this morning. With Jesus being questioned, receiving a series of questions, after which he himself will respond with another question, though we won't get quite there tonight in this lesson, but we will in the maybe next Sunday morning, I guess. So far, we're in this last week, the final week of Jesus' earthly life. On the Friday, he arrived at Bethany. On the Saturday, he had dinner with Simon and where Mary anointed him with the precious, costly ointment. On that next day, Sunday, was his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Monday was the cursing of the fig tree and the temple cleansing. And then early on Tuesday, he's teaching in the temple. We saw where his authority was challenged. We saw where he was responding to the challenge of his authority. And that's pretty much where we still are here on this very, very busy Tuesday, the longest and the busiest day, it seems, of his whole earthly ministry. A lot of different events recorded on this day that all seem to fit into this one day. Of course, the gospel writers themselves don't make a point and an effort to say, and it was Tuesday, and Jesus did this, and then we don't have a point where they say, and then on the next morning at Wednesday, then these things started. So scholars have sort of compiled the things together, and some have seen an issue with the fact that so much is crammed into this one day, but, it's not impossible, so that's that, as far as I'm concerned. If it's possible for this many things to have happened in one day, then what's the problem? So we're still on this day and will be for a few more lessons at least. I've sort of further divided it up by adding a little extra parts here. So this is the third lesson of the Tuesday. A day of questioning really. Attempts to trap Jesus. Deja vu. Even if we didn't look at a little bit about it this morning, it just seems like this is just over and over what's happening, because that's all the enemies of Jesus could do, other than believe in him, which is what they should have done. But they wouldn't allow themselves to do that, and therefore they had to try to get him somehow. They had to take him down, and the only way to take him down is to dig up some dirt on him. Problem is, there's no dirt to dig up on him, so they got to create some dirt. And that's what they're going to try to do. That's what they've been trying, and they fail every time. If they can't find any fault, then the best they can hope for is to either turn Rome against him with deceitful measures, or turn the people against him with deceitful measures. No matter what route they take, any choice but believing in him is going to have to be done through deceitful measures. And that's what they've resorted to. Just imagine being surrounded by all these people who simply do not like you, who are waiting and rooting for your downfall, and are working actively to bring that about. That's what Jesus is going through now, more strongly than ever. He's already experienced it before, but now more strongly than ever before. So this is where we come to Matthew 22 and verse 15. We saw the parables from the end of chapter 21 and going into 22, the first part of chapter 22. Now, and if you remember, we pointed out how that was an effort on the part of who is called the council in some places. They're not called the council in Matthew here, but they're called the chief priests and the elders of the people, generally considered to be the Sanhedrin, this united attack. Well, that one failed. So now the separate groups are going to undertake to get Jesus. So what we read is that the Pharisees went, notice right after that parable, Matthew records, then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. So immediately, it seems, or in response to Jesus succeeding once again in dodging, not really dodging, but being victorious over the attempt to bring him down, they go and do what they've always been doing. They're going to go behind closed doors and plot. They got to look at all the preparation and planning they've had to do already so far. And every time they meet Jesus face to face, who didn't do any preparation, more or less, had no prep course or whatever for their specific attack, and he always gets them anyway. So here they go again. How are we going to get him? What can we do? So here's what they did. Matthew's account says the Pharisees, who were the enemies this time. We got the Pharisees, and they sent their disciples. This is a new tactic. They sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians. Now, who are the Herodians? Well, I'll give you a hint. They're not ambassadors from a country called Herodia. But you can probably spot, well, you can't because it's not up there. That's what I get when I have the next slide showing, and I think that's what's already up there. The Herodians were supporters of Herod, basically. At this time, that's essentially all they were. They weren't really religious. They weren't a religious group. They were a political party. Their sole allegiance, really, was to Herod. Now, that's significant because the Pharisees would have been disgusted with that, and them. They would not have liked each other. They didn't like each other. They hated the Herodians because they hated Herod. And if they hate Herod, and they had at least fairly legitimate reason to not like Herod, but they're not going to like any group that supports Herod. If you support Herod, you support Rome, and so what a strange alliance this is between the Pharisees and the Herodians. But the reason that they recruited, more or less, the Herodians at this point is going to be made a little bit more clear whenever we see what their tactic was. So they sent their disciples. Why do you think they would send their disciples? Or anybody else for that matter? Okay, they're supposed to be smart they should have been. They probably were intelligent. Intelligence, sadly, doesn't overpower bias.
Because they had already been busted.
Okay, yeah, they've been there trying, and they've already gotten too familiar, I guess, and involved in trying to trap Jesus. So they need fresh soldiers, if you will, fresh faces, mainly because they would be able to better pretend. Isn't that sad? If you're unfamiliar with them, they can pretend to be something that they're not. And that's exactly what they do, isn't it? Look at how they started. Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. That is a textbook way to try to disarm somebody. But they weren't just trying to disarm Jesus' suspicions. They were trying to more or less lull him or induce him to be fully in the open. Answer as carefree as possible. No reserve, no hesitation. Because that's how you trap somebody in their words, isn't it? When you get that tongue flapping, that's whenever they're going to get in trouble. So that's what they're trying to do. Get Jesus to be off of his guard, to be, relaxed, not suspect anything, it's strange and ironic. The things they say are not only true of Jesus for the most part, but they're exactly opposite of themselves. All these things that they just said.
Okay, Jesus was referred to as the Word. They hated Jesus because of what he said and what he was teaching. When somebody is told the truth, you have two reactions. You either accept it or hate the person who told you. And that's essentially what happened. He always told them what God wanted him to say. And most of that meant, you guys have got to change. And
Yep.
they didn't want to do that. So it wasn't that they didn't like the way that he looked, they didn't like what he did, they did not like what he said. Probably how he said it.
Yeah, they were not a fan of what he stood for in general.
Exactly.
But especially whenever he started to hit close to home to them, and specifically, which he's really going to do in the next chapter. So if they didn't like some of the things he had said already, they are really not going to like what he has to say in chapter 23, which kind of leads us to wonder if Jesus would have been so blunt and pointed in chapter 23 if the things that happened in chapter 22 hadn't happened. But they were more and more bold and consistent with their strategies and their attempts to trap him, so he laid into them. Mm-hmm.
But he had said it before when he told them that their father was the father of lies. And it's like, no, our father is Abraham.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, what you're saying comes from the father of lies.
Yep.
So he's told them,
Clearly, they wouldn't have liked that. They wouldn't have been a fan of that, even though it was true, and they needed to know that what you're doing makes you his son, whether you like it or not. Makes you one of his children. Not God, not Abraham, but the devil. If you don't want to be a child of the devil, then stop doing what you're doing. Stop being this way. Be like Abraham, be like God, but you won't. So you need to understand that who your father really is. So that's how they introduced themselves to him, or introduced this question. And the question was this, very, very calculated question. Tell us then, what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now we can start to piece together at least a little bit why they may have brought the Herodians along with this particular plot. Because that would put even more pressure on Jesus to be careful what he's going to say. Because with the Herodians on board, you got virtually both sides of the spectrum right there. If the Herodians and the Nationalist Party and the Zealots and whoever else, not the Zealots, but the Nationalist Party and the Herodians weren't there, and the others weren't there, or either or, then Jesus could maybe think, well, this group's not here, so I don't have to worry about offending them. I could just say something that the other side will like. Or if it was the other way around, it'd be the other way around. But when you got both, you got to really try to walk that line in the middle, because otherwise it could end in disaster. Well, Jesus is a mastermind of this kind of thing. He knows how to handle it. And we see that's exactly what he did, because what they were hoping for, naturally, when you ask a yes or no question, was a yes or no answer. If he said yes, it's going to be a problem. If he said no, it's going to be a problem. But let's look a little bit more about their question itself. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Josephus would seem to suggest that this was a specific tax that was basically a tax that was based on 14 to 65-year-olds living in a particular area. A tax that everybody that fits in that category would have to pay. So that's a pretty, I guess, overall a pretty hefty tax, because there were probably quite a few 14 to 65-year-olds. That's a pretty big age range. But there weren't too many taxes like that one. And so it wouldn't have been like a tax that people rarely pay or that not very many people had to pay, but it was one of the more common ones, I guess. So it was going to be more controversial depending on how he asked, more substantial in its effect. So if he said yes, then, or rather no, then he's basically commanding a rebellion against Rome. So that if he says that, they're not going to say, well done, Jesus, we agree. They're going to say, hey, Rome, guess what? Jesus is starting a rebellion just like it happened before. Might as well call him Jesus Maccabees, because he's doing exactly what the Maccabees did. Well, if he says yes, then, that is, if he says simply yes, it is, then that's going to be a jolt to the hearts of the people listening, because in their eyes, that would have more or less been kind of to renounce his claim of being Israel's king and Messiah. So even though it wouldn't have been to do that, many of them would have perceived it that way. So he's really in a trap, in a fix here, and they probably think we finally got him. There's no way he's getting out of this, especially since we got these disgusting Herodians on board. Can't wait till they go home and we can get away from them. But for now, they're pretty useful. And as we saw this morning, Jesus was aware of their malice. How? Doesn't specify, in Matthew's account at least. But he was aware of it. It may have been more than obvious, but he calls them out. Why do you test me like this? Why do you put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax. Now, naturally, Caesar's image is going to be on that coin. And the Jews more or less held it as acceptable or across the board that the person whose likeness was on the coin is, that's just a way how life is. That's their coinage. The tax is to be paid to them. We may not like it. Anybody here like paying taxes? I don't know anybody that does. At least who would choose it if they could choose. Like, nobody's so happy. You're like, yeah, I can't wait to give my money away to fill somebody's pockets. Certainly not going to fix the roads. So I don't know what it goes to, but it doesn't go to me. But anyway, we won't go there. I did, but we won't go any farther. The Jews understood that that's the way things were. And it was acceptable. It was not something that was condemnable to pay taxes to a civil authority. And yet there was a party, a group of people among the Jews, a fairly considerable group, that did not see it that way, and that said more or less that to pay tribute money to Caesar was virtually, ultimately, to disown the authority of Jehovah. And he's supposed to be Israel's only true king. He is Israel's only true king. And that if you pay tribute money to Caesar, you are disowning Jehovah's kingship, his sovereignty. And there are many people that were probably standing around Jesus that sympathized with that idea. They also would have said that all the problems that Israel as a nation is having is because of national unfaithfulness. And so for Jesus to simply say yes would get him in trouble, even though it would have been the right answer, because according to the question itself, is it lawful? Yes, it's lawful to do that. It's not just lawful, lawful in the sense of, is it not wrong, but it's actually right to do that as far as it goes. But Jesus, knowing their hearts, he said, "Show me the coin." They showed him. He said, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They knew, what could they say? So they said simply, "It's Caesar's." Tiberius Caesar, the son of Augustus, is essentially what the inscription would have said. So they said, "It's Caesar's image, it's Caesar's inscription." And he said, "Therefore," there's that word again. It's an important word. Jesus' statement is connected to what just happened. "Therefore, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." In other words, the fact that that was Caesar's inscription, Caesar's image, directly contributed to the reasoning of why the money should be rendered to Caesar, because it is Caesar's. And the fact that that was such a good answer is shown in the fact that they marveled. They marveled because they couldn't believe their eyes and ears that he got out of this. How did he do it? Beats me, they were probably thinking. But we didn't see that coming. I don't know why they wouldn't have seen it coming, but they didn't. They left him and went away. They could have hung around and argued more. But what could they possibly have said? Their purpose was to get him to either offend one side or the other. Now, they weren't going to be offended either way, because they would have been delighted at either answer, because they could have taken it and run with it. But instead, he didn't give them anything. So what could they have said? They could have said, "Try again, Jesus." "We don't like that answer. Give us another answer." But apparently it was enough that they didn't think of doing that. But his answer was perfect. It was just spot on perfect. And I'll just read what Alfred Edersheim said about it, because I think I wouldn't be able to put it in it any better. He said, Jesus' answer did far more than just rebuke their hypocrisy and presumption. It answered not only that question of theirs to all earnest men of that time, but it settles to all time and for all circumstances the principle underlying it. Christ's kingdom is not of this world. And he says, a true theocracy is not inconsistent with submission to the secular power in things that are really its own. Politics and religion neither include nor exclude each other. They are side by side in different domains. The state is divinely sanctioned and religion is divinely sanctioned, and both are equally the ordinance of God. On this principle did apostolic authority regulate the relations between church and state, even when the latter was heathen. That would be a reference to Paul. Even when the government was as corrupt, we think our government's corrupt. If we could go back in time for a week, we'd probably rethink that. Because, coming from somewhere like that, our government would look more pristine than anything we could ever imagine. So, sure, every government in time will become more and more corrupt, sadly, because humans are in control of it. But even when it's far more corrupt than our government, Paul said there is a balance and there is a level of submission that even Christians are to offer to the civil authorities, because God put them there. So if God put them there, then how can it be against God to pay the tribute money? And if God put them there, wouldn't that then mean that it's wrong to not pay the tribute money? So it's actually the exact opposite that they were implying, or trying to get him to suggest it. Not only would it not be wrong to pay the tribute money, but it would be wrong to not pay it. Of course, Jesus couldn't say it like that, or then they really would have jumped on him. But Edersheim goes on to say, Jesus' answer elevated the controversy to a whole other sphere. where there was no conflict between what was due to God and to man. And yet he didn't speak harshly of the nationalist aspirations that would have been utterly against Rome. And at the same time, he didn't plead the cause of Rome. So he perfectly walked that line in a way that totally shut the mouths of his enemies. We give up, basically. Remember when they brought the woman that was caught in adultery, they said, and Jesus handled that, and what they do? They just filed out. Nothing more we can do. They left the woman there. They just, here they go. They're going home. That's what they're doing again. Let's go home, boys. They probably didn't say a word. They just turned around, left. Nothing they could say to him and nothing they could say to each other. Of course, once they got behind their closed doors again, they probably had plenty to say. So, what did Jesus teach here? We have an obligation to fulfill civil responsibilities. It's not inconsistent with total allegiance to God. In fact, it's part of it. To resist the authorities is to resist God, because He put those authorities in place. Now, of course, the caveat there, the problem is whenever the civil authorities go against God, and then, of course, we must obey God rather than man. But up to that point, we have a responsibility to submit. We can pray to God that they will be as, that they will leave us alone as much as possible. Seems to me that's what Paul encouraged Christians to pray for, that we can live a peaceful and tranquil life. Paraphrased version would be, pray that they will just leave us alone and stay out of our lives as much as possible. But sometimes it's not that way. And we've been very blessed in that regard compared to most of the world, and especially most of the world throughout history. Thoughts, comments on question number 1 or attempt number 1, Pharisees and Herodians versus Jesus? Jesus wins again, doesn't he? Jesus always wins. And always will. And he wins again. Now, the same day, again, Matthew doesn't tell us what day it is, but we know this is the same day of that. So if we calculate it to Tuesday, then we're still at Tuesday. Sadducees came to him. So he's already defeated the Sanhedrin. He's defeated the Pharisees and their disciples and the Herodians. Now he's going to deal with the Sadducees. And Matthew goes ahead and tells us who the Sadducees are in the context of this conversation. Those who say there is no resurrection. Now, to say there is no resurrection, what he means by that is they don't believe in spirits, they don't believe in afterlife, they don't believe in anything after this. They don't even accept most of the Old Testament. Only the books of Moses, which is only 5. Might be a big chunk, but it's only 5 out of the Old Testament books in our English Bible. I think it's 5 also in the Hebrew Bible, but 39:27, so 5 out of 39 in the English Bible. So they would attest that in the inspired Scriptures, there's no support for any such thing as life after life or spirits or anything like that. I have no clue how they could possibly justify that claim, but there it is. So they come to Jesus with this question. Teacher, Moses said if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. They bring up a hypothetical. I am not a fan of hypothetical cases in an argument, because most of the time the hypothetical is so far-fetched that it's not even able to be determined if there is even such a case that could ever actually happen, that ever has happened or ever could or would happen. And it seems to me that almost every hypothetical case in any sort of debate or discussion falls under that category. That how do you even know that this is actually a thing that happens? Like, well, what about baptism, for instance? Well, what about a person who's stranded on a desert island and he's the only one there? You ever heard that one before? I have. Multiple times, many times. And every time I'm thinking, who is that even a real thing? Besides TV? Are there people stranded on desert island? Castaway, great movie. Classic movie. I don't think it really happens in real life. So, I mean, that's just a hypothetical that is built specifically to try to prove the thing that they already believe, which is that there's no way that you would have to be baptized to be saved, because what about a person who's stranded on a desert island? Blah, blah, blah. Well, this is the kind of thing that the Sadducees are doing here. Yeah, Joe?
But sometimes, hypotheticals, a person has to carry their logic to conclusion. So you have to make sure that whatever you're thinking will end correctly. In the case that they're giving now, 12 husbands, one thing, maybe 2 or 3, you still have the same problem as to what they did on earth, what they required, and what could happen in heaven. Now with the baptism thing, I always go to his promise. If you ask, you will see. If you find, he'll give it. If you want to be baptized, he'll see to it that you are.
Yeah.
I mean, I have no doubt in my mind.
Yeah.
And I've argued with people who came up with that, and they finally agreed. It's like, is he powerful enough to do it? Of course he is. He's done it. He'll do it again.
Yeah, again, it's, hypotheticals are not the norm. Even if they're possible, what difference does that make? If God's word is universal to all time and circumstances. So whatever God says, you can come up with any crazy hypothetical you want. God still said what he said. So if that's what he said, then that's what he said. But I bring that up just because this is what they're doing here. They've already got their conclusions sorted out. They think that they're 100% correct. There is no resurrection. And they think that this riddle of a question proves it somehow. If a man dies having no children, or that's what Moses said, now their question, now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no offspring left his wife to his brother. So too the second and third, down to the 7th. After them all, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife will she be? For they all had her. Now they think this is a gotcha moment. There's no way this case could possibly be sorted out. And therefore, there can't be such a thing as a resurrection. Now, from where I'm standing, that's extremely faulty logic in the first place, because there could probably be more holes than one pointed out in that line of reasoning. But Jesus just points out 2. The 2 biggest holes in their argument. And Jesus understood they were making an argument. That's why he answered the way he did. It wasn't just a question, it was an argument. And by argument, I don't mean let's argue. I mean they were making a case. They were trying to make a case against the concept of the resurrection. Which, by the way, they also knew that Jesus did believe in, and that's why they took it to him. Jesus says, Joe, what did Jesus say?
You're wrong.
You are wrong. Okay, see?
Only in ESV.
Well, you err and you are wrong are the same thing.
I made a mistake.
Yeah, okay. Well, he says, you err or you are wrong. See, Jesus knew they were making a claim. They weren't really asking a question. But here's the 2 holes. Number 1, you don't know the Scriptures. Number 2, you don't know the power of God. In other words, you're assuming that would not be possible because you don't understand and respect the power of God. In other words, you don't think God would be able to sort that out? What do you think? Do you not know who God is? 7 men and 1 woman? You don't think God could sort that out? if he needed to. That same argument could be made for a lot of things that are claimed against what the Bible teaches, like creation and things like that. This could not possibly have been the case. Well, that's because you don't respect and understand and appreciate the power of God. God could do that. Oh, you're telling me the story about Jonah is a real story and that really happened to somebody? That's ridiculous. That's impossible. It could never happen. You don't know the Scriptures or the power of God. You're telling me that the universe was created in 6 days? What a joke. Took billions of years for this to evolve. You don't know the Scriptures or the power of God, especially the power of God. But they also did the same thing that is done with the theory of evolution, just to point that out, that we don't believe this is true, and therefore we're going to base all of our conclusions on, all of our everything on what we already say is not true. Even though science and everything else proves that what we say happened doesn't happen and can't happen, we know that it did happen because we're here. See, that's not proper reasoning or logic. If science and everything else says that this doesn't happen and can't happen, then it didn't happen. If it can't happen, it didn't happen, period. And I have no reason to think it ever did. That's with evolution, the process of evolution or the Big Bang and everything like that. There's nothing, all the evidence proves that it can't happen, and therefore it couldn't have happened. But that's not what they say. They say, well, yeah, it can't happen, but it did because I think it did. Well, they're saying, we don't think there's a resurrection, and so we know there's no resurrection because what about this hypothetical? These 7 men and the one woman, there's no way that could be sorted out according to the law of Moses, and therefore there is no resurrection. Jesus says, you don't know the Scriptures or the power of God. Number one, there is no marriage in the resurrection, so God wouldn't have to sort it out. He could have sorted it out if He needed to, but He doesn't have to because there's no marriage in the resurrection. Well, there's that one done away with. They didn't see that coming at all. How are they going to argue with that? They're not going to be able to use anything to say, what do you mean there's no marriage in the resurrection? Because, Moses said, no, Moses didn't say a word about that. So they're not going to be able to argue that. But then he said, as far as the resurrection is concerned, in general, have you not read what was said to you by God? Isn't that an interesting statement? Have you not read what was said to you by God? We need to think of the Bible that way too. A lot of people say, God didn't say anything to me in the Bible. He said something to a bunch of dead men. He didn't say anything to me. Well, Jesus didn't see it that way. Have you not read what was said to you by God? I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Remember from this morning where I said that's quoted from? What book of the Bible? I'll just leave it at that. You got five choices. Exodus. What book of the Bible is Exodus? Number 2, so that's in the Sadducees' canon as they would view it. So Jesus quotes from the books that they uphold to be God's Word and says, haven't you read that in the book of Exodus that Moses wrote? Just like what they came to him. Teacher, Moses said this. Well, he says, well, guess what? Moses said this too. He's speaking for God. Now Moses is quoting God. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. In other words, even though Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were dead, God was, at that moment when He said those words, still their God. And while we may not see that as a strong case or a strong argument and say, well, that doesn't even work, because he could say that and he's referring back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he doesn't mean that they're still alive. He just means that I was their God when they were alive. Well, they didn't apparently see it that way because they didn't, or they would have come up with that. They would have said, that's not what that means. It doesn't mean that he's alive, that they're alive, but that's his point. God is not the God of the dead. If the dead just vanished into nothing when they die, if men vanished to nothing, He wouldn't be their God. He'd be the God of nothing. What would be the point of saying, I am the God of Jacob and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Because basically he's saying, I'm the God of nobody and nothing. But he is the God of something. He's the God of the living, not the dead. In other words, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still living. The Sadducees would have agreed God is the God of the living. But God said, after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had left the earth for many, many years, that he is still their God. Therefore, if God is the God of the living, and God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are living. And that was the end of that. Notice it says, we don't get their reaction, but we get the crowd's reaction. Jesus always mindful of the people around. When they heard it, they were amazed. They were astonished at his teaching because it was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Of all these things, of all the things that a man in Jesus' position could have done with this attack, I don't think anybody else that's ever lived would have done what he did. Even if they had known what he knew, they wouldn't have approached it the way he did. But everything that he did, every step that he took, every route was so perfectly calculated to be the most effective possible option that not only directly addressed what was thrown at him, but did so in a way that just left everybody in awe. His wisdom, his thoughtfulness, his boldness. Here's some things we can learn from his answers that our lesson points out. Number one, it's important that we explain why we do things, as in the case of the Pharisees. That is, pay taxes to Caesar. Number two, it's important that we use the Scriptures to explain answers, like with the Sadducees. It's important that even when we're surrounded by our enemies, we stay focused on the situation and glorifying God. He could have made it all about them and him, and between him personally and them, but he didn't. Even though he knew what they were up to. Number four, don't forget the people around you. The one challenging you is not the only one who matters. So even if I really would get a lot of satisfaction out of just really blistering these guys, schooling them, really making them feel like they wish they had never been born, there are people watching. And that may not have had such a great effect on those people. Jesus was always mindful of that. In fact, you might say that was one of the most important things to him, is the long-term, lasting effect of what he did and said. And so he was never careful to the point that he was afraid to ever answer, but he always answered perfectly.